Book 4, The Galilean Ministry, Chapter 1, Rejection at Nazareth. The desert was silent again. John the Baptist had been interrupted in the midst of his work and hurried away to the grim fortress of Machaerus, on the eastern side of the Dead Sea. This sudden move was made by Herod Antipas. John had condemned the method by which Herod had taken his brother Philip's wife, and in doing so he had brought upon him the implacable hatred of this woman. She was responsible for Herod's order to arrest him, and even his incarceration in the darkness and filth of the dungeon did not satisfy her savage craving to injure him. While there is no evidence that the religious leaders in Jerusalem had anything to do with this silencing of a voice which had been very disturbing to them, there can be little doubt that they viewed the course of events with satisfaction. A dangerous enemy had been removed, and the manner of his going freed them from any necessity to defend themselves. They could point out to the people the dangers of listening too carefully to itinerant preachers, who denounced the nation's divinely given shepherds and set at naught traditions venerated for centuries by true Israelites. Jesus heard of the arrest of John while he was in Jerusalem. He immediately left for Galilee. From this time forward, he worked without intermission, preaching, healing, and instructing his disciples. It was as though this was a signal for which Jesus was waiting, and with the silencing of John's voice, the people of Israel were to hear the voice of the one whom John had proclaimed. Arriving at last in Nazareth, Jesus was once more in the environment of his childhood, surrounded by scenes he knew so well, recognized by men and women with whom he had grown up. It was but a few months ago that with his leather apron wrapped around him, he had been busy with hammer and saw, fashioning yokes and plows and furniture, listening to the troubles of the villagers, caring for his mother and his younger brothers and sisters. How much had happened in those short months! To all outward appearances, Nazareth was still the same, but to him it was already remote. The need of humanity was upon him. The strong, earnest face of Peter, the exalted cry of Nathanael, the cool breeze on the rooftop, the teeming thousands searching his face with new hope and longing, these things separated him now from the carpenter's bench. He was about his Father's business. The people looked upon him with new eyes too. The news of his exploits in Jerusalem and of his miracle at Capernaum were too well authenticated to be untrue or even exaggerated. But they could not forget the wood shavings on the floor of the shop, or the noise of the hammer. They looked at Jesus and remembered Mary and her family, and when he approached those in need of healing, neighborliness prevailed, faith failed, and suffering lingered on. Only a few sick folk forgot the carpenter and believed. Nevertheless, the Sabbath brought expectation and excitement. It was the custom for the ruler of the synagogue to invite visiting rabbis to speak, and the building would rapidly fill. Some of the worshippers had seen his divine indignation displayed in the great temple itself. How would he act now? What would he say? They would be conscious of him the moment he took his place among them. It was an occasion of the greatest importance to the people of Nazareth. The future of each individual worshipper depended upon his attitude during the next hour. It is always a momentous occasion when Jesus speaks for the first time to a man's soul. For our Lord, too, it was a situation of no little delicacy. For many years he had attended that synagogue. Because the Spirit had not then anointed him to speak, he had kept silent through innumerable services. He could have corrected many imperfect expositions. He could have unfolded many difficult passages, but he had held his peace. Now he was anointed to preach the gospel to the poor. He was to be silent no longer. There can be no doubt that he had prayed and meditated upon the work that waited for him on that Sabbath morning. As in all his ways, he would seek the guidance of his Father and wait for him to prepare the way before him. There had never been a Sabbath like this in Nazareth. The service began. The prayers were uttered. The benedictions pronounced and answered. The law had been read by several members of the congregation. At last the time came for the reading of the prophets and the sermon. The officer approached the ark, the cabinet which contained the scrolls of the law and the prophets. He took out the roll for Isaiah, which was the appointed reading for the day. He removed the linen cover which protected it and handed the scroll to Jesus. Conscious only of the guidance of his Father, Jesus opened the scroll. He began to read. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he hath anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He hath sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them that are bruised, to preach the acceptable year of the Lord." Jesus turned the scroll and handed it back to the minister. He had been standing to read. Now he sat down to teach. The air was tense with expectancy. The eyes of all in the synagogue watched every movement, waiting breathlessly for him to speak to them. It could almost seem that these words were prepared by God 700 years before, just for this moment. To his own neighbors who had watched him grow into manhood in their midst, there was no claim of divine origin, of conquest, or of kinship. The context of the words he had read is an extensive one, stretching back from the 49th chapter to the end of the book. It reveals the whole work of the Messiah through the day of his suffering, rejection, and death, disclosing the blindness of Israel and the significance of the sacrifice of their Messiah. The vision widens until the calling of the Gentiles is revealed, and it does not fade until Israel is restored and all mankind rests in the glory of God, ruled by a returned Messiah, when Jerusalem is rejoicing and her people a joy. The people of Nazareth were loath to associate their carpenter with these great prophecies, but the words Jesus read to them would identify him to those who were willing to be taught. Few among them had not heard of the baptism of Jesus by John the Baptist at the fords of the Jordan, and the subsequent declaration of the prophet. Few of them had not heard of his healing touch and his words of authority in Jerusalem and even in Galilee. To sincere, thoughtful minds, these things were a direct fulfillment of the words Jesus had read. "This day is this scripture fulfilled in your ears." So Jesus began. We have no record of the way in which he developed his discourse. We only read of its effect upon those who listened. And they all bear witness and wondered at the gracious words which proceeded out of his mouth. The day of vengeance had to come. It was a day to be pondered over indeed, with a certain fearful looking for of judgment. But it was not yet. It had no place in his immediate message. It is interesting to notice that this is the first occasion when Jesus was careful to distinguish between his first and his second coming. The discourse drew to a close. We can well imagine the spellbound silence that prevailed for a few moments until one by one his audience began to forget the words and concentrate upon the speaker. The speaker became once more the carpenter. His mother and his brethren came to life. The past 30 years began to unfold, and Jesus, knowing their hearts, realized he had failed to convince them. Already there were those who were jealous of his work of healing at Capernaum, and had noticed he had not been able to do very much among them. He anticipated their mood and reminded them of episodes in their history. When prophets of God were in their midst, the Israelites had been passed by, and aliens had been the subject of divine ministrations. This was too much for the people of Nazareth. Forgetting the synagogue and the Sabbath, the people who a few moments before had wondered at the gracious words Jesus spoke, hounded him through the narrow streets of the town, pressed him towards the brow of the hill, intent upon hurling him to his death. When their purpose was unmistakable, Jesus turned and faced them. They fell away before the awful majesty of his aspect. He walked through their midst and made his lonely way over the mountains towards Capernaum. Nazareth, like Jerusalem, had not known the day of her visitation, and she was to suffer the condemnation of Christ's neglect. He had come to his own, and his own had not received him. No longer was Nazareth to be called his city. That honor was reserved for the hometown of his disciples, James and John, Peter and Andrew, the town whose synagogue was the gift of a benevolent Roman, presided over by the believing Jairus, the town where even now the nobleman's family was rejoicing over the restoration of its son, and showing an active belief in Jesus. True, Capernaum was not worthy of him, and was yet to be the subject of his condemnation. But no city or place will be worthy of the coming of the Son of Man until the day when he comes to fill the earth with God's glory and bring in everlasting righteousness and peace. Book 4, Chapter 2, The Call of the Four. The first clear picture the Gospels give us of Jesus beside the Lake of Galilee is an earnest of what he was to experience during the months ahead. Luke tells us that as he approached the lake, the people pressed upon him to hear the word of God. Although they would have heard of the healing of the nobleman's son, it was not the prospect of seeing any display of power which brought them to him. That was to follow. Rather, their national hopes were stirred by the things that they had heard concerning this rabbi who had sprung up in their midst and who had created such a storm in Jerusalem. They were anxious to hear him speak and confirm from the prophets the hope which they hardly dare entertain. Among the many fishermen whose boats lay heeled over on the beach were 4 who had been waiting with eager hearts for this moment. 3 of them, Peter, Andrew, and John, we have met before. They had shared exciting experiences in Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria with him. They had seen his works of power and enjoyed the wonderful privilege of listening to him as he spoke of his Father's kingdom. James was John's brother. They shared in the fishing undertaking which prospered under the management of their father, Zebedee. There can be little doubt that in the long silent hours of the night, as their boat dipped in the inky waters, John had told his brother about Jesus. His glowing tribute and utter conviction had convinced James, and, without the personal preparation which the other 3 had enjoyed, he was ready for discipleship. Peter and Andrew were casting their net when they became aware of an increasing commotion. Looking up from their work, they saw a vast concourse of people pressing round one who had already become dear to them. Jesus was back in their midst. It was a breathless moment for them. As they watched, they saw that he was making no attempt to satisfy the people's clamor. He was moving purposefully towards them. In a few minutes he stood facing them, and they were looking into his eyes. This was the moment for which they had longed and prayed. It was the moment for which his absence had prepared them. They had found during the past months that his nearness was essential for their happiness. There had been little satisfaction in their daily toil. They had been living on their memories and their hopes. Now those hopes were realized. He was standing here before them, reviving by his presence and his familiar features all the resolutions that their highest aspirations had conceived. But there was no time to lose in greetings. The crowd pressed hotly upon them, and they were in danger of being pushed out into the water. Jesus had a purpose in seeking them out. "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." Without the slightest hesitation, Peter and Andrew dropped their nets on the sand and went with him. A little further along the shore, James and John were busy with their father Zebedee and some of the servants washing and mending their nets. The 2 brothers lifted their eyes to find Jesus regarding them intently. Again the senses of the Galilean fishermen thrilled as they heard the words which were at once an invitation and a command. "Follow me." They responded immediately, leaving their father and their work to begin a life of no less hardship and more uncertainty. But because it would be a life in which they would remain in the company of Jesus, share his works and his thoughts, they were content. Looking at these 4 sturdy, sincere men, each different, yet having in common the desire to follow him without counting the cost, Jesus was under no illusion about the difficulty of the task he had set himself. But because he had implicit faith in his Father's guidance, and recognized in these men his Father's gift to him, he was able to say confidently, "I will make you." Many weary months of misunderstanding and doubt lay between them and their complete transformation. But by love and understanding, sympathy and rebuke, their education was to be developed until the day when they were to continue his work in the earth, worthily reflecting the glory which shone forth from him. Even now their calling was not complete. It was for 3 of them the 3rd stage in their spiritual relationship with their Lord. Now they were called to discipleship. Soon their vocation would be apostleship. Having fulfilled the purpose which had brought him to the lakeside, Jesus turned to the people who sought him and were eager to hear him. He chose Peter's boat, and having besought him to launch it and anchor a little from the shore, he sat down and taught the multitude. His discourse over, Jesus turned his attention once more to the men who had so eagerly obeyed his call. He was anxious to show them in a way which they would never forget that he had asked them to revoke their lower calling for a higher one. They were to be fishermen still, But their work was no longer to be limited to the waters of the lake and the darting silver forms which struggled in their nets. The whole world was to be their fishing ground, and the seething crowds now reluctantly dispersing on the shore were to be enclosed in their net. So the first great lesson of their discipleship began. Launch out into the deep and let down your nets for a draught. Peter demurred. There was little any fisherman could teach him about these waters. He knew where the fish could be found. He knew the best season and time for a catch. He recognized its presence by the ripples and shadows of the water. His experience told him that there was no hope of a catch that morning. If any fish were to be caught, the only possible chance was during the night, and their boats had just returned empty from their night's fishing. Peter was willing to acknowledge the leadership of his new master in spiritual paths, but surely Jesus had nothing to teach him in his daily tasks. Ah, Peter, how wrong you are! How wrong is every disciple who fails to acknowledge Jesus as his master in every walk of life and every place of experience. Unless our surrender is complete, we shall toil all night and catch nothing. Happily, Peter's doubts were redeemed by his obedience. Nevertheless, at thy word, I will let down the net. In the presence of Jesus and under his direction, the nets were lowered once more. It was immediately evident that a profound change had taken place which confounded all Peter's natural skill and experience. The sea was boiling with fish, and as the nets were drawn in, they broke under the weight and strain. This was a lesson which Jesus intended for each of these men, and unconsciously Peter, in his excitement, brought the others into its influence. He called to James and John in the other ship to come and help them. Soon, both ships were so laden with fish that they were in danger of sinking. Peter worked feverishly, his mind completely bewildered by the experience. He had seen Jesus perform miracles before, miracles that many would believe were far greater than this, but he had seen nothing that touched him so closely. He needed nothing more to convince him that he was in the presence of the Messiah. His first feelings were utter unworthiness and an overwhelming sense of sin. And because it was Peter, he expressed himself in hasty words. He fell down at Jesus' knees, crying, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord." But Jesus was not critical of his words. He rejoiced to see how well he had learned his first great lesson of discipleship, and how truly he had been affected by a penitence of spirit, which groaned in the depths of its unworthiness. "Fear not, from henceforth thou shalt catch men." How imperfect an expression of his heart Peter's words were was shown as soon as the boats reached the shore. Luke tells us that as soon as they had brought their ships to land, they forsook all and followed him. Book 4, Chapter 3, A Sabbath in Capernaum. The Sabbath which followed the calling of the four from their lakeside tasks was a memorable one. It began in the synagogue at Capernaum, where Jesus was invited to speak to the people. The effect upon these eager, warm-hearted Galileans, removed from the disconcerting evidence of his lowly origin and human contacts, was profound. Even in Nazareth, the worshippers had forgotten their prejudice when he spoke to them. They were lost in wonder as they listened to his gracious words which he spoke. So it was in Capernaum. So it was to be throughout Galilee and Judea. To listen to Jesus must have been an experience which could never be forgotten. He spoke with an authority which contrasted unmistakably with that of the scribes. There was a power in his utterance which was denied the most learned scribe. There was a conviction that made all the teaching which they had heard before pale and lifeless. There was more than this. The strong, radiant character of Jesus shone forth in his teaching. As with his works, so with his words. Jesus gave himself, and those that heard and saw felt something that was utterly beautiful and holy. He spoke to them of the love of God and the glory of his kingdom, and told them of the demands it made on all those who responded to his call. As his hearers listened, they must have been elevated far above the constricted limits of their narrow lives. They must have had visions of a beauty and a purpose they had never dreamed of. They must have seen something of the men and women it was possible for them to become. and the vision was given reality as they looked up at the face of the one whose life was uncompromisingly dedicated to God. The evangelist conveys all this in the simple words, "He spake in their synagogue, being glorified of all." The service was suddenly interrupted by the cry of a demented man. The words of grace had been too much for his tortured spirit. His voice rang through the building. "Let us alone! What have we to do with thee, thou Jesus of Nazareth? Art thou come to destroy us? I know thee who thou art, the Holy One of God." A deathly silence followed, broken only by the fitful sobs of the exhausted man. Jesus alone remained calm, completely master of the situation. Then, with a deeper note of authority in his voice, was heard, "Hold thy peace, and come out of him." The command penetrated into the confused brain. It produced a terrible conflict, the effects of which the horrified watchers beheld in the writhing, sweating form at their feet. Then, with a final heart-rending cry, it was over. The man lay still. The wildness in his eyes was gone. The demoniac's strength had evaporated. The power of Christ prevailed. If the teaching of Jesus had amazed the people, this supreme mastery over evil spirits awoke in them something that was entirely new. In common with both Greeks and Romans, the Jews accepted the existence of malignant spirits with an almost fatalistic tolerance. They believed that all disease was the result of indwelling demons, and in the case of mental disorders, epileptic fits, and other similar derangements, one can sympathize with the bewilderment which occasioned such a belief. A person so afflicted was accepted philosophically, and few entertained a hope of cure in spite of the spectacular efforts of the exorcists. Jesus had stirred the people to their depths with words which both amazed and charmed them. That he should follow this by bringing sanity and peace to this madman brought forth indescribable emotions. Mark records, and immediately his fame spread abroad throughout all the region round about Galilee. Jesus left the synagogue with his 4 disciples and went down to Bethsaida, to the house where Peter lived. Peter was a married man, and his wife and mother-in-law, with his brother Andrew, shared the house by the lake. It was a house which was often to be the abiding place of Jesus in his frequent visits to Capernaum, and we can well imagine with what joy Peter would welcome his illustrious guest. But on this occasion there was no welcome. No meal was prepared for the little company on their return from the synagogue. Peter's wife would not be able to conceal the anxiety which gripped her heart. Her mother had suddenly been stricken down with a burning fever and lay desperately ill. But Jesus was in their midst, and they lost no time in telling him of the misfortune which had so quickly darkened their home. In a moment, the whole scene was transformed. A few minutes before, their master had been looking down at the red, fever-stricken features. Now the bed lay empty, and the stricken woman was busily preparing a meal for them. What a happy repast it would be, with their loved one restored. While the little company were rejoicing in their waterside home, things were happening throughout the town of Capernaum and in all the surrounding region. The news of the healing of the demoniac in the synagogue had spread rapidly from house to house. In many dwellings in Capernaum there was suffering and sorrow, as there is in every age and town. In those houses the door of hope, locked and barred perhaps for years, slowly opened, as the certainty of the miracle was established by the irrefutable evidence of many eager lips, and the information went round that Jesus was still in their midst, abiding in the house of Peter at Bethsaida. So as the evening shadows brought the Sabbath to its close, the pilgrimage began. Little companies emerged from humble homes all over the town, carrying or leading their pathetic burdens. As they converged upon the fisherman's house, the cries of pain mingled with the shouts of madmen and the appeals of their guardians. The sick were laid on the ground until it was impossible to get near the house. In the graphic language of Mark, all the city was gathered together at the door. At last, hundreds of straining eyes discerned Jesus. He was in their midst with words of comfort and power. Before him lay sick bodies and tortured minds. Behind him was restoration, peace, and new hope. The pilgrimage to the lakeside had been painful and slow. The return was joyful and eager, broken bodies reveling in their newly found freedom, distraught minds delighting in their clear impression and rational thoughts. The superb picture Mark has painted by his phrase, "At even, when the sun did set," presents a canvas which extends far beyond Capernaum and becomes almost symbolic. We are able to see God's anointed upon the earth, standing in the midst of suffering humanity, purging the effects of sin, bringing restoration and gladness. The work done, the last footsteps faded away in the darkened streets. It had been a long, strenuous day for Jesus, and his tired body cried out for rest. But it was more than rest that he needed. We cannot read the records carefully without realizing to some limited extent that Jesus did not take away the suffering without great cost to himself. The very sight of the vast numbers of sick would be a poignant experience to his sensitive mind. The act of healing was a responsive act of giving. To give to so many without intermission would be exhausting, not only to the flesh, but to the spirit. The body was satisfied with a few short hours of repose, but the spirit was not. Rising up a great while before day, he sought the spiritual refreshment that could only be found in the presence of his Father. Long before even the early rising fishermen had stirred, he left the house, and making his way through the deserted streets, found a solitary place among the hills behind the town, and there prayed. Some hours later, the awakening household would notice the empty couch. Outside, there was evidence that the activity of the night before was going to be repeated. In the first light of day, people began to collect around Simon's house and wait for the appearance of the great healer. The disciples, led by Peter, began to look for him, and then, perhaps coming suddenly from behind a rock or breasting a steep path, they saw something they would carry with them to their graves. They stood on holy ground. It would always be a precious and disquieting memory. They saw the Son of God at prayer. It is a scene too sacred to dwell upon. Each devoted heart will contemplate it and draw his own inspiring thoughts. To Peter and his companions, it must have been a revelation of the inner source of their Master's life. And as they watched his gracious ministry in the days that followed, they must have thought again of the prostrate form in the early morning light, and realized that his acts of love and power had their source in deep and sacred fellowship with his Father. They must have realized, too, that if this communion was so vital to him, it must be even more necessary for those who lacked his divine heritage and spiritual vision. This surely was the seed which developed in their minds until the opportunity came during one of the sweet moments of heavenly intercourse that they made their request, "Lord, teach us to pray." Book 4, Chapter 4, The First Leper. Standing on ground consecrated by the communion of Jesus with his Father, the disciples pointed back towards Capernaum, where the crowds were once more gathering. Already some of the people had heard that he was missing and had followed Peter and the others into the hills. "Lord," said Peter, "all men seek for thee." But Jesus did not return. He led his disciples away from the town towards the surrounding villages. "Let us go into the next towns, that I may preach there also, for therefore came I forth." This apparently sudden decision to leave Capernaum may have been one of the results of his prayer. It may have been when Jesus stood at the door of Simon's house the previous evening and saw the multitudes of sick awaiting his gracious touch, he realized that a crisis had arisen. The all-important mission of Israel's Messiah was not to be a wonder worker. His power, manifested at this moment in healing, was subservient to his greater work of revealing the truths of his Father's kingdom and rendering to him the complete obedience which would make that kingdom a reality. The miraculous works which accompanied his preaching were to be a witness to all men that God had sent him. That they were so largely concentrated upon the alleviation of human suffering is both a revelation of God's love in Jesus and an earnest of the day when Christ's work shall be fully accomplished, when, as described by John in memorable words, "There shall be no more death, neither sorrow, nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away." If that present emphasis continued, the mission of Christ would fail. Men's temporal needs would be abundantly met, but their realization of a far greater salvation would be lost. In this crisis concerning his work, Jesus sought the solitudes, and it may well be that the decision to go further afield was conveyed to him by his Father. It was a development which could only have a beneficial effect upon the people of Capernaum, allowing time for their excitement to evaporate and giving them the opportunity of considering his works in the light of his words to them in the synagogue. Thus began the first of a number of circuits from Capernaum into the populous regions of Galilee. It was the commencement of an almost unbelievable period of popularity. Jesus had captured the imagination of the people. His name and power were spoken of in every household. Men flocked from all parts of Palestine and beyond to hear him. The multitudes grew to such proportions that it became a physical impossibility for him to address them in the narrow winding streets of the towns. He was forced to lead them out onto the hillsides and into the deserts. As he approached, he drew the people from their villages for miles around, and they converged upon him from all directions, leaving only the oldest inhabitants to guard their possessions. Caravans traveling on the roads of Galilee during those months must have been subjected to many delays. Roman officials and men of affairs must have made many irate inquiries concerning the slowness of the progress and the reason for the great concourse of people. But in their haste to reach him, there would be few detailed explanations. The impatient travelers would have time to reflect upon the name which was on everyone's lips. Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus of Nazareth. There were many sick people jostled in the milling crowds. They came borne on improvised beds, on asses, on primitive carts. Parents carried their blind and infirm children. Class distinctions were temporarily suspended, as rich and poor, freeman and slave, Pharisee and tax collector mingled together and surged towards the place where Jesus had chosen to preach and to heal. Even an occasional leper could be seen hesitating a few yards beyond the outmost fringe of the crowd, the lower part of his face covered, but his eyes revealing his heart-rending desire to be seen by the healer and cleansed. We read so often the gospel accounts of the healing of the sick that we may possibly forget to pause and meditate upon this great beneficent work of Jesus. Can we see this mother with her blind little daughter in her arms struggling to get near Jesus, crying hysterically because her efforts are frustrated by the burly, selfish men who impede her? Can we see her finally reach him, breathless and crushed, but full of triumphant faith? She eagerly lifts her arms to let him take her burden from her. She watches his sensitive fingers caress the sightless eyes. She sees his own eyes close in prayer, and when they open, it is to smile a welcome into the bright little eyes that look for the first time upon the world that until this moment has only been heard and touched. The mother cannot speak. She can hardly see him through the mist of tears. But he understands. He smiles and blesses her before he turns away to heal once more. Day after day, these simple, moving episodes were repeated in hundreds of families. Men and women came to him pale and emaciated. They went away glowing with health. Pitiable maniacs were brought to him struggling and shouting. They left his presence with inward peace. There were some hideously revolting sights, but he quietly ministered and restored, never impatient, never too tired. And throughout this gracious ministry, Jesus preached the things of the kingdom. The miracles he wrought had a direct bearing on his teaching. He had come to proclaim salvation, to invite men to turn to God and receive the adoption of sons. He prepared men's minds for the time when, under his hand, the whole earth would be filled with the glory of his Father. In a very real sense, the kingdom of God was at hand. He was the king. His obedience unto death was to set the seal to God's purpose. The precepts which he taught were the principles upon which the kingdom would be governed. Each miracle he wrought over disease and death was a symbol of the final abolition of sin and the final victory over death. Each mastery over the powers of nature was an earnest of the day when all the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord, and he shall be governor among the nations. This thought is wonderfully expressed in the 103rd Psalm, where the words of the psalmist can apply equally to the coming of the man of sorrows and to the coming of the Lion of the tribe of Judah as king of the whole earth. Bless the Lord, O my soul, cries the inspired psalmist, and forget not all his benefits, who forgiveth all thine iniquities, who healeth all thy diseases, who redeemeth thy life from destruction, who crowneth thee with loving kindness and tender mercies. Those who respond to the teaching of Jesus become children of the kingdom. In obeying his commands, they practice the principles of his kingdom. They can only look for persecution and sacrifice in their mortal life because, like their Lord, their kingdom is not of this age. They live and die in the confidence that the day of the Lord is coming, and with it the full realization of all their hopes. In his teaching, Jesus therefore concentrated upon the spiritual qualifications which were necessary in all those who desired to be children of his kingdom. His teaching, as well as his miracles, set all Galilee in motion. We have only a glimpse of the things he said, but it is sufficient to make us understand why men and women flocked to hear him. His words were simple so that a child could understand them, yet they searched the inmost recesses of men's hearts. He illustrated his teaching by vivid pictures of the familiar scene around him: the sky, the birds of the air, the animals of the field, the sower and the plowman, the vineyards and the husbandman. All made their unique contribution to his message of life. Nor was the intimate domestic scene forgotten, drawn from his own experience and his observation of how men lived. The oven and the candlestick, the leaven and the salt, the clothes and the family dishes, were woven into the rich and colorful pattern of his teaching. He revealed, too, an intimate knowledge of the religious, political, and social background, and many were the scenes given a new meaning to shed light on some spiritual truth. Listening to him as he sat in their midst, his hearers had their eyes opened, and for the first time they would see beyond the limits of their daily life to the far horizons of God's everlasting love and purpose. No longer would Yahweh be to them as remote as he is omnipotent. His Son revealed him as a father, intimately concerned in the welfare of his children, knowing their needs before they ask, yet desiring them to lift their faces to him, as a parent finds joy in the upturned face of a child. He spoke to them of the great things that his Father had determined to do in the earth, of the day when all creation would unite in a paean of praise and worship, when the discord, the suffering, and the hardships of the present world melt away, peace and joy would reign, and death itself would be swallowed up in life. He showed them how they could prepare themselves for that day by humility, self-discipline, and above all, a responsive love that found expression in their attitude to one another. He had complete understanding of the difficulties of the task he had set them, but he assured them that they were not fighting a lone battle. With his help, they would win through to victory. Looking into his earnest face and feeling the authority of his words, his hearers began to see the kind of men and women they could become. When we think of the inspiring effect of Christ's words on us, the resolutions they draw from us, the insights they give us into the resources that are at our command, reaching us as they do through the comparatively cold medium of printed word, we can form some conception of the profoundly moving influence they would have had upon those who heard them from the lips of the living Lord. It was on this tour of Galilee from Capernaum that we have the first record of a leper coming to Jesus. The fact of his approach is an arresting commentary upon the gracious ministry of Jesus. Lepers were particularly anxious to avoid rabbis, or any that had the power to enforce the rigorous code of prohibitions which kept them separated from society. A leper was an outcast, spending his living death in the ruins and caves of the desert and the countryside. His hair was disheveled, his clothes rent, and the lower half of his face covered. Although he was not allowed within the walls of a city, special provision was made for him to worship in the smaller synagogues, but it was a place apart, and he had to arrive before the first worshipper, and was not allowed to leave until the last had gone. No one was permitted to acknowledge a leper or stand within 6 feet of him. No other disease could have more effectively symbolized sin, and those who had the terrible misfortune to be its victims were treated more like criminals than incurable patients. Many of the severe restrictions were necessary for the protection of the people, but in practice they went far beyond the wisdom of expediency. Unhappily, the religious leaders were sometimes guilty of the most savage mental and physical cruelty. One case is recorded of a rabbi who refused to eat an egg which had been purchased in a street where a leper had been seen. another of a rabbi who boasted that he had protected his fellow men by keeping a leper away from them by hurling stones at the unfortunate outcast. It seems very probable from the confidence of this leper's approach that he had been watching Jesus for some time. Lingering far back behind the multitude, the stricken man had been unable to hear the words of Jesus, but he was able to catch the importance of them by the rapt attention with which the people listened. He had seen the sick carried and led towards the center of the crowd, but no sick returned, only empty couches and rejoicing people. Slowly a great hope was born in the wretched man's heart. Was it possible that he could approach this great healer? If only he could get through the endless surging crowd, he knew he would be cured. This man who gave the blind their sight, cured the maniacs, lifted the paralyzed from their beds and sent them walking away with praise on their lips, this man could restore his rotting flesh and deliver him from his living death. As the hours passed, his faith strengthened into action. The people nearest to him were horrified to hear his dreaded cry, "Unclean! Unclean!" No longer the monotonous cry of despair, but an urgent, triumphant shout. They shrank away quickly, widening an avenue that led towards Jesus. At last he stood before him, startled at his own temerity. The ravages of his affliction horribly evident. They were almost alone. The crowds had backed away. Looking into the eyes of Jesus, he found his confidence once more. He fell forward on his face. His cry of faith rang out, "Lord, if thou wilt, thou canst make me clean." He waited a breathless eternity. Suddenly he felt firm, gentle hands close upon his scaly flesh, the first human touch he had known for years. And then he heard the voice of Jesus. The leper's "if" had moved the Lord. His response was, "I will." And then with a word of authority, the evil flesh melted under his touch. The scarred and wasted body glowed with health. Would that the deeper leprosy of the soul could be so easily dismissed. But that is a slower work, a work in which Christ can only minister with the steady cooperation of the sufferer. Faith has to be joined by a dedication of the heart and the will. But the victory can be won if the desire for spiritual health is as great as was the leper's longing for physical perfection. For the Lord's "I will" to the cry, "Thou canst," has lost none of its effectiveness. The injunction of Jesus that the restored man should say nothing to any man concerning his restoration may sound strange in the view of the multitudes that watched the miracle. But it can be understood in light of two considerations. Matthew records a similar reticence of Jesus and refers it to the fulfillment of the prophecy of Isaiah concerning him, "He shall not strive nor cry, neither shall any man hear his voice in the streets." Men would flock to him in their thousands, but he would make no declaration of his power to increase his popularity. The clue to the second consideration is afforded by Mark when he recorded the healing of the blind man at Bethsaida. On that occasion, Jesus sent the restored man to his house with the command, "Neither go into the town, nor tell it to any in the town." A man who had been subject to a spectacular healing could easily go into the towns boasting of his cure and become the center of interest and speculation. Nothing could be worse for his spiritual welfare. If a cured man could be persuaded to tell no man, but go quietly home, meditate upon his restoration, and praise and worship his heavenly Father, that man would be on the highway to a fuller restoration. Jesus sent this man to the priest, telling him to make the offerings of birds and lambs which Moses had commanded. The veil of the temple had not yet been rent, and with his characteristic reverence for God's requirements and the deep humility that marked all his actions, he acknowledged the office of those who even now were conspiring against him. Had the priest who received the restored leper had eyes to see, he would have seen an ambassador from the Messiah of Israel, who had come with unmistakable credentials. But so far as we know, like so many of his kind, he was conscious only of his exalted office, and the opportunity passed him by. Book 4, Chapter 5. Forgiveness of Sins. The return of Jesus to Capernaum from the surrounding country excited the attention which would be expected after the momentous events of the last Sabbath he spent in the town. To the many accounts which were circulated from house to house and discussed at the corners of the streets was added the amazing story of the healing of the leper. It was not long before Peter's house at Bethsaida was once more the center of attraction. Those who had waited in vain when Jesus had failed to return to the city after the early morning spent in prayer were joined by many others who had come to hear and see this new rabbi who had set Galilee aflame. There were scribes and Pharisees, too, who were anxious to observe him more carefully. During that first Sabbath at Capernaum, they had been swept along in the general enthusiasm. By now they had time to think and to consider his teaching. Moreover, it was necessary, they reminded themselves, in view of their responsible status, to assess their own position. Away from the compelling power of his presence, their ardor cooled. They recognized in his teaching a studied disregard for legal righteousness. This was confirmed by reports that multiplied from Judea. They realized that if they were generous in their support of this rabbi, they would incur the displeasure of the temple authorities to whom they owed their religious vocation. When Jesus therefore addressed the multitudes that filled Peter's house and overflowed into the street outside, there was a sudden stir in the crowd, and a path was reverently opened up towards the house as a number of scribes and Pharisees made their dignified passage to the forefront. What their attitude would have been had the discourse proceeded on its normal course, we shall never know, because a sudden interruption changed the whole scene. 4 friends of a poor man suffering from the dreaded disease of palsy were convinced that if they could get the sick man to Jesus, he would be cured. When they approached the house, they saw at once how difficult their task was going to be. It was impossible even to reach the door. They might have waited for the discourse to finish and for Jesus to come out of the house, but great need does not brook delay, and great faith overcomes every difficulty. Most houses in Palestine had flat roofs which were approached from the outside by stone steps. There was no difficulty in carrying the sick man up. The roof was usually made of rubble and hard earth and paved with bricks. It is unlikely that the men made any attempt to break it, which would have been a dangerous and senseless action. It was most likely that Jesus was speaking from the portico of the house, which was covered by a lightly constructed canopy. This they removed, and when the hole was large enough, they gently lowered the sick man until he lay at the feet of the Lord. The interruption was dramatic. All eyes were turned upwards as the hole appeared and was gradually enlarged. The mat and its burden appeared and slowly descended until it rested on the ground. Then the palsied man's wandering eyes found the object of their quest. They looked into the eyes of Jesus. Beholding him, the man became oblivious to the hot, crowded place, of his friends peering down intently from above, even of the illness that had emaciated his once strong frame. He was conscious only of Jesus and of his own sinfulness. Probably his sickness was the direct result of a sinful life. His friends had brought him in faith, but he had come in penitence. And looking now into the strength and holiness of the eyes that held his sense of despairing unworthiness, and with it his fears, increased 100-fold. But Jesus was lifting him up to something higher than he had ever known. He began to understand how much his need was of the Spirit and how little of the body. When he made his request, it was not, "Lord, make me whole." It was, "Lord, forgive." But this was a silent colloquy. The tense watchers heard nothing of it until Christ's final answer, "Son, be of good cheer. Thy sins are forgiven thee." The tension broke. The sick man felt the comfort of the peace which flowed through his whole being. But in that company, many strange emotions stirred. The faith of the bearers, the relief of the stricken man, the astonishment and wonder of the people, the prejudice and opposition of the scribes. Many who watched the scene had witnessed Christ's healing power and had no doubt that the man would be healed in view of this spectacular demonstration of faith. But they were totally unprepared for these words, by which Jesus showed them the true significance of this and every other miracle he performed. In offering men forgiveness, Jesus occupied a province which had been the prerogative of God, but he was about to justify his assumption of this office. The people may have accepted this, but to the scribes it was a challenge which could not be ignored. The sick man may be satisfied, but they were not. Yet they did not speak. They kept their thoughts to themselves, veiled behind expressionless faces. Jesus turned his attention upon them. His gaze searched their hearts. Now grace turned to judgment. "Wherefore think ye evil in your hearts?" The scribes were not wrong in questioning whether it could be possible that God had delegated his power to forgive sins to this man. They were wrong in defying the evidence that he was continually offering to prove it. Jesus had not forgotten the cripple at his feet. He would have healed him in any case. Now, however, he accommodated his healing to their folly, not so much for their benefit as for the people who stood by. Once more he showed them his authority. It would have been equally ineffective for them to say to the diseased man, "Thy sins be forgiven thee," or to say, "Take up thy bed." Although in the first case their ineffectiveness would not be seen. In the second, it would be manifested by the invalid's inability to respond. But for the Son of Man, it was no more difficult to forgive sins than it was to heal. True, they could not, in the nature of things, see the effect of the first, but they could see the result of the second, and that proved the validity of the first. Turning to the man at his feet, the word of command rang out, "Arise, take up thy bed, and go into thine house." Immediately the man rose, and walking through the wondering throng that made way for him, returned home, peaceful in mind and whole in body. All who had witnessed the scene wondered greatly and glorified God. The opposition of the scribes and Pharisees was stillborn. It was attacked and defeated at its source. But Jesus knew that the conflict had only begun. Very shortly, supported by men specially sent from Jerusalem, it would flare up into unremitting warfare. The doors now hospitably open would close at his approach. He had come to do his Father's will, and it should be accomplished at whatever cost. Purposefully he traveled the lonely road of self-sacrifice and hardship, deterred neither to the hatred of his enemies nor the solicitude of his friends. The connection between sin and suffering was often misunderstood by the people of Christ's day. If a man suffered, it was the direct result of a specific sin. This was one of the few current errors which Jesus stepped aside to correct. But in a general sense, suffering and death are the result of sin, and one of the mysteries of suffering is that so many godly characters are its victims. The association between forgiveness of sins and freedom from suffering is in this general sense a very real one. In the case of this palsied man, the interval between forgiveness and restoration was short. It was in Christ's purpose that it should be so. In many, many cases, it is extended, sometimes for years. There are those who endure a life of suffering, and death overtakes them as a merciful release. But whether the interval be long or short, whether indeed it never come at all in mortal life, the words of the psalmist remain true. "Blessed is he whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered." For that man, whatever his physical state, there is peace and harmony in his life, and the glorious expectation of ineffable joy in the day of restoration, when the reconciliation which Christ achieved by his death finds its complete fulfillment in the kingdom of which he preached on the hills of Galilee. Book 4, Chapter 6, The Call of Matthew. During his stay in Capernaum, Jesus spent most of his time by the lakeside, healing and teaching the multitudes who resorted to him from every quarter. One day he approached the custom house, set at a strategic point outside the town, where the famous Way of the Sea joined the Lake of Galilee. The official in charge of this post was an unpopular Jew named Matthew. All who furthered Rome's interest in Palestine were hated by the great majority of their countrymen, but particularly the class of publican to which Matthew belonged. For there were two types actively engaged in collecting money for the occupying power at the time. The tax gatherers were responsible for the normal taxes, but the custom house officials were directly responsible to the Roman government for the duty on the exports and imports of the country. They also received tolls from users of the roads and the bridges, from the boats which used the harbor facilities, and from the merchants who traded in the markets. Travelers entering or leaving Capernaum would have to stop at the custom house, unload their mules or camels, and subject their merchandise to the keen eyes of the custom official, who had required duty which ranged from 2.5% to 12.5% according to its nature. It will be readily seen that these officials had numerous opportunities for bribery and extortion, and there can be little doubt that most of them used these means to amass quick fortunes, enjoy their power, and the patronage of those wealthy families to whom they granted immunities which were denied to the poor. As we should expect, the scribes and Pharisees were particularly opposed to all publicans. Whilst perforce they had to admit them into their synagogues, they lost no occasion of showing their distaste and contempt. Should any synagogue official ever succumb to the temptation of getting a more lucrative living by joining the publicans, he was forthwith expelled from his duties. Sitting day by day outside his custom house, Matthew would undoubtedly see and hear much of Jesus. He would see the steady procession constantly moving down the wide paved road towards Capernaum, from the poor homeless wanderers to the impressive caravans of the rich and their attendants. He would see the sick and the halt and the blind carried and led towards the place where Jesus was preaching. Ships would come across the lake, bringing their burden of people eager to join the throng. He would answer the countless questions that would be breathlessly put to him concerning the present whereabouts of the prophet. He would without doubt have had personal acquaintance with Peter and Andrew, James and John, and would have heard perhaps with amazement, possibly with understanding, that they had left their homes and their trade to be the disciples of the prophet Jesus. There were probably times when, moving along the shore, Jesus would stop to heal and preach within sight and sound of Matthew's roadside custom house, and amid repeated interruptions he would hear many of the gracious words that Jesus spoke, and see a pale face change to a healthy glow under his touch, and a raving madman become calm and joyful at a word of command. He would be strangely impressed by the contrast between the teaching he listened to and the law-bound repetitions of the scribes, by the way in which he ministered to the lowest and meanest suppliant, people from whom the scribes would have shrunk in horror. He would be encouraged to hope that with this man there would be sympathy and encouragement, where everywhere else there was bitterness and scorn. Then, because of his unique position, he would be one of the first to learn that all was not well between Jesus and the religious rulers in Capernaum. They were his enemies too, and he would feel a bond of fellowship with this gracious teacher. And so it seems very probable that gradually, all unknown to himself, Matthew became in spirit a disciple of Jesus, but a disciple who could never acknowledge his allegiance or hope to the favor of the master he watched with growing eagerness. But on this morning, Jesus paused when he reached the custom house. His shadow fell athwart Matthew's desk. Looking up, Matthew met eyes of ineffable love, which conveyed to him the message even before the lips could utter the words, "Follow me." And the man who during long years had become hardened to angry words and bitter looks, left the parchments and the money chest in the roadside cabin, to become first a disciple and then an apostle. The official who for so long had added to men's burdens was about to enter into the intimate service of him whose life work was to remove them. Instead of his pen being inspired by selfish gain to record transactions in his ledger, it was to be his gracious privilege, inspired by the Spirit of God, to open a new account in the record of the eternal purpose of the Father, as now revealed in the life and words of his beloved Son. The call of Matthew is a striking example of the complete disregard of Jesus for the opinions of men. It also illustrates how he quietly pursued a course which, from a logical point of view, could only do his cause a great deal of harm. There can be no doubt that the dramatic choice of Matthew led to a deterioration of the people's opinion of him, as well as a hardening of the opposition of the scribes and the Pharisees. From the point of view of his ability to keep the support of the people and alleviate the disapproval of the religious rulers, it would have seemed much wiser to have ignored Matthew and accepted the scribe who was prepared to follow him whithersoever he went. But Jesus had the perspective of the ages. He knew that his work was only beginning with the completion of his earthly mission. His choices and decisions were based upon the future as much as the present. This is one of the less easily recognized and more difficult paths along which his disciples are called. It is only after long association that we can make mature judgments which are based upon the true recognition that the things that are seen are temporal and the things which are not seen are eternal. That Matthew was a comparatively wealthy man can be gathered from the great feast which he arranged at his house following his call. It is a gesture which affords us a glimpse of his character, because the guests he invited to meet Jesus were his fellow publicans. The occasion was both a farewell and an invitation. It marked the end of his life of affluence and the beginning of a life of poverty. But he was quick to recognize that in reality it was exactly the opposite, and we can believe that he was anxious that his former associates would be similarly persuaded when they met his master, and make a renunciation like his. Jesus came to the feast, accepting the expression of gratitude gladly, knowing its source and its object. As in all things, he judged the heart, but others were not so charitable. The event did not escape the notice of the local scribes and Pharisees, and with a cunning which reflects little credit upon them, they approached the disciples, realizing no doubt the harm they could do Jesus by sowing disquiet in their minds. How is it that he eateth with publicans and sinners? The Master did not allow his immature disciples to be exposed to the subtlety of these men. As was his custom then, so it is his promise now, that he will intervene in these crises of challenge and persecution, and we are thankful to his enemies, not because of their opposition, but because they evoked this gracious reply of Jesus on behalf of his disciples. His defense for loving the unloved is among the most beautiful of all the things which Jesus uttered, full of heavenly pleading and exquisite pathos. None can bring out the character of a man better than his enemies, and here, as so often in the Gospels, the sheer beauty of Christ's shines forth as he answers these scowling, unfriendly men who seek only his humiliation. In their blindness and perversion, they question the company he keeps. With simple dignity he assures them that this is his rightful place. He was a doctor, and no doctor worthy of the name would spend his time among the healthy. His true place was with his patients, and the more serious the illness, the longer he would be with them, and the more frequent his visits. A complete answer to their challenge, it was also an indictment to those who made it. It exposed as bad physicians those who had been given the responsibility of healing. Instead of strengthening the weak, they avoided contact with those who needed their help and were in obvious fear of infection. But there was far more in his answer than this for those who would thoughtfully consider its implications. It provided the true interpretation of his healing work among the bodily sick. All men were guilty in God's sight and worthy of death. In his grace, the Eternal Father was pleased to give that guilt another name, and called it sickness. But it was still a sickness unto death, and it could only be cured by the physician of God's provision. Thus, when Matthew records the healing of Peter's wife's mother, he adds, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, He took our infirmities and bare our sicknesses. Yet deliverance was not complete until God sealed it with the wounds of his beloved Son. Jesus was careful not to accept the postulation of their question. The obvious inference they made was that they were righteous. Go ye, and learn what that meaneth. I will have mercy, and not sacrifice. For I am come, not to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. The object of Jesus in making this quotation from Hosea will be seen when we too go and learn what it meaneth. The message of this prophet, as indeed with all the prophets of Israel, was the sickness of Israel, an indication of their punishment, and a glimpse of the restoration which would finally be granted in the mercy of God. None but the God of Israel could accomplish this, and then only by the greatness of his loving kindness. Thus, the Spirit, through Hosea, says the Assyrian could not heal them. But the healing would come, and the word comes to the prophet, I will heal their backsliding, and I will love them freely, for mine anger is turned away from him. In the 6th chapter, where we are given a prophetic insight into the new covenant, when the mercy of God will be manifest to Israel, words which point with wonderful significance to the death and resurrection of the Messiah, are prefaced by Israel's acknowledgement of her sin and God's ability to heal. Come, and let us return to the Lord, for he hath torn, and he will heal us. He hath smitten, and he will bind us up. If only those scribes and Pharisees had obeyed the Lord's injunction, and meditated upon the words to which he directed them, they would have learned that they were in dire need of the physician. They needed him more. Their sickness was greater than the publicans, because of their faithlessness to their trust. This exchange between Jesus and the local synagogue officials was followed by an interruption from the disciples of John the Baptist. It is possible that their question was inspired by the Pharisees. A certain affinity seems implied by their challenge, "Why do we and the Pharisees fast oft, but thy disciples fast not?" With beautiful appropriateness, Jesus led them back to their own master's words which each of them would remember because they were so often repeated by the prophet who now languished in prison. "Ye yourselves," John had said, "bear me witness that I said, I am not the Christ, but I am sent before him." Jesus identified himself with John's words. He was the bridegroom. His disciples had recognized and acclaimed him, and because he was still with them, it was an hour for rejoicing and not for fasting. But the bridal feast was not yet. The bridegroom must leave his disciples alone. That would be their time of sorrow and fasting. Jesus sealed his argument by the two metaphorical parables of the garment and the wine, both associated with the bridegroom. "No man," he said, "putteth a piece of new cloth into an old garment." The ceremonial fasting of the Pharisees and of John's disciples was part of an old system that was ready to vanish away. It had been superseded by the arrival of the bridegroom, who had come to consecrate a new and living way. The garment which is worn out to the point of uselessness cannot be made serviceable again. The new material will only emphasize its poverty. And then, as his manner was, Jesus changed the figure and deepened the truth he was expressing. "No man putteth new wine into old bottles." The garment had only to do with an outward aspect. Now Jesus turns to something which affects the inward condition. His mission from God as the physician and the bridegroom was to turn a deathly heritage into an eternal one. But this great gift could not be received in an unregenerate, darkened life. A transformation had to take place, gradual, painful, and unmistakable. Jesus conceded that men do not straightway desire the new. They say the old is better. It is the cry of the flesh, clinging desperately to its natural inclinations. But when Christ truly enters, it becomes a despairing cry, in the light of the recognition that the flesh profits nothing, but that his words are spirit and life. Thus, graphically, Jesus anticipated in this parable the words of his great apostle to the Gentiles. "If any man be in Christ, he is a new creature. Old things are passed away. Behold, all things are become new." Book 4, Chapter 7, Lord of the Sabbath. During this period of activity in and around Capernaum, Jesus came into open conflict with the Pharisees on the question of the Sabbath day. It was inevitable that it should come sooner or later, and the amazing popularity of Jesus, together with his complete answer to their charges and criticisms before the multitudes, led them to watch him with the utmost care. If they could find something in which they could irrevocably condemn him, they would restore their damaged prestige, and also do his cause a great deal of harm. The Sabbath offered them the best opportunity to do this, because, although he always attended the synagogue to worship, he was also prepared to continue with his ministry of healing. Walking through the cornfield with their Lord one Sabbath day, the disciples paused to eat some ears of ripening corn. Several times during these active days, when Jesus moved unweariedly among the people, teaching and healing, neither he nor his disciples had the opportunity to pause long enough for a meal. The Pharisees were carefully watching for such an opportunity. There was no Sabbath calm and reverence in their hearts. Scarcely had the disciples begun to eat than their Lord was challenged. "Behold, thy disciples do that which is not lawful to do on the Sabbath day." Jesus could so easily have turned upon them with withering scorn and exposed their littleness. He could have pointed out to them that his disciples were perfectly justified by the law of God, but had only broken their puny tradition. But if these men in their hatred had disclosed their ignorance of the significance of the Sabbath, Jesus had not. His shining example emphasized the meanness of their quibbles. Mercy still prevailed over judgment, giving his enemies a further span to see the error of their ways. With all the persuasion of sweet reasonableness, Jesus dealt with their accusation. he called upon the law and the prophets to justify the actions of his disciples. What would be your attitude towards King David and his followers who, like my disciples, hungered on the Sabbath? He went into the house of God and took the showbread, which it was only lawful for the priests to eat. He did not ignore a tradition, he broke the law of God. And would you find fault with the priests, who in the execution of their duties profane the Sabbath? But as he so often did on such occasions, he widened and deepened the context, and gave a new meaning to the whole conception of the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. The Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath day. In sublimely simple words, Jesus did far more than defend his disciples. He went back beyond the law to the divine purpose in instituting the Sabbath. It was not a burden imposed upon man, but a blessing bestowed upon him. Like sacrifice, it was not ordained to give man the opportunity of doing something to show his goodness, but rather to give him the consciousness of both his need and of the divine provision to meet it. Its immediate significance was in rest for the body and solace for the spirit. The Pharisees had failed to understand even that proximate end. They had brought low this beneficent law of God by introducing innumerable restrictions, which showed how much they had lost the spirit of God's dealings, and indeed of his character. Under their heavy hand, the Sabbath had become an intolerable burden. When a life is dedicated to God, its purpose steadfast and its motive pure, the man-made restrictions to attain legal righteousness become not only irksome and unnecessary, but positively harmful. The whole teaching of Jesus created the incentive to seek and to love God. In doing so, he freed men from impositions, which at their best could be but a poor substitute for true piety and morality, and at their worst could encourage the grossest self-esteem and hypocrisy. The denial of these ordinances did not prevent adequate expression of spiritual life. Rather, it cleared the way for it. Jesus gave incentive and power to a holiness and consecration undreamed of in the law. He demonstrated it by his own radiant example. He showed that response to God's love lay not in the bondage of the letter, but in the liberty of the spirit. This fundamental conception was the great gulf that was fixed between Jesus and the religious rulers of his day. The things that the scribes and the Pharisees taught had become the acknowledged standard of religious life. Jesus exposed them as the great evil of his time, forming a barrier between man and the true knowledge and worship of God. The conflict was as inevitable as it was bitter. It had of necessity to be unto death. If only these men had forgotten their littleness for a moment. If, in the light of his words, they had dispassionately viewed their charge against the disciples, they could hardly have failed to perceive that it was almost laughable. They were not accusing them of taking the corn, that was permissible. But according to the mature judgment they were enforcing, the action of rolling the ears between their hands constituted the process of threshing. It was because their minds were full of this pettiness that they were unprepared for the revelation which followed. But I say unto you that in this place is one greater than the temple. The priests ministered in the temple on the Sabbath. Both Sabbath and temple must give way to the one who is greater than either, and he is standing in their midst. The Sabbath is not an end in itself. It is typical of the rest that remaineth for the people of God. The temple is but an evidence of the condescension of the Almighty to the limitations of men. Its chief significance lay in its essentially prophetic character, pointing forward to the time when the tabernacle of God shall be with men, and he shall dwell with them. Both these features were dependent upon God's purpose of redemption in Christ. He was thus higher than both, Lord of the Sabbath, and greater than the temple. One of the great tragedies of that and every age is that men and women are so preoccupied with their real or imagined rights and privileges that the great revelations of God which have power to transform their whole lives are unheeded. It is an evil which can have its victims in the household. At times, when the rights and wrongs of an issue are the subject of heated discussion, it is always wise to pause and listen to the voice of Christ. He can restore the true perspective. However complete a truth, and however sublime a teacher, men's understanding is blunted when their hearts are darkened by malice and evil. The following Sabbath found the scribes and Pharisees watching with unabated intensity. All eyes were upon Jesus as he entered the synagogue and approached a man whose hand was withered. Would he dare break the Sabbath law before them all in the house of God? Jesus knew their thoughts and deliberately chose to make the issue clear beyond the slightest doubt. Turning to the afflicted man, he commanded him to rise and stand forth in their midst. He then challenged them. I will ask you one thing. Is it lawful on the Sabbath days to do good or to do evil, to save life or to destroy it? What man shall there be among you that shall have one sheep, and if it fall into a pit on the Sabbath day, will he not lay hold on it and lift it out? How much then is a man better than a sheep? His questions went unanswered. No man spoke. Impervious alike to his pleading and to the need of the man whose arm hung helplessly at his side, they waited for him to act so that they might accuse him. Jesus looked upon them with anger in his heart at their unrelenting hardness. This was the spirit which would dog his footsteps through Galilee and Judea, endeavoring to thwart every gesture of love. It would not bend to the warmth of Christ's pleading, but eventually it would break under the heavy blows of Rome. But his anger turned to love as he turned from them to the suppliant who waited eagerly for his healing power. Stretch forth thine hand. Obedience brought restoration to the sufferer and frustration to the enemies of Jesus. They went away, anger crystallizing into settled hatred and envy. They held a council and even consorted with the Herodians. Their one preoccupation was how they might destroy him. Their persistence, which was at last to win its terrible reward, is a bitter commentary upon the depravity of the human spirit. It is also a wonderful revelation of the grace of God shining through his beloved Son, that when Jesus heard of the evil counsels, he withdrew himself, and when great multitudes followed him, he healed them all.